speaking of real estate and speaking of where Australians' money is, I suppose super's a big one. Retail shares is sort of a big one, but property's massive. And perhaps I could ask Bessa, is that safe as houses at the moment? I mean, property market, we know supply is low and demand is high as population grows. Is that a dynamic that's going to continue and are house prices going to keep rising?
Generally speaking, the stock market is now 15%.
Yeah, look, I think it was interesting what was said earlier about the planning, because planning is a part of the problem that we hear quite frequently from our builder and developer customers, just how long it takes to get through planning to build dwellings. And certainly if we have a look at dwelling approvals, so you need to get a dwelling approved before you build it, that's well off the peaks in the recent cycle. It's down around 50 to 70% depending on which state or territory you live in. So we know that residential construction activity is going to slow further, and slow at least for the next 12 to 18, if not 24 months. At the same time, remember that net overseas migration figure that I gave you that breached 500,000. Most of those migrants come to live in Victoria and they come to live in New South Wales. So dwelling activity is slowing at a time when the population's exploding. The cash rate has been driven high 13 times by the Reserve Bank to 4.35%. The next move will probably be a cut. But as I said, there are some risks that might be delayed later into the year. And even then, when the rate cutting cycle begins, based on market pricing and based on the Reserve Bank's very own forecasts around inflation growth and unemployment, it may not be that deep a cutting cycle. And so really that gives you a recipe for this housing shortage to continue. But it has opened up a two-tier residential housing market, and I would put Sydney, Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide in one bucket. I would put Hobart, Canberra and Darwin in another bucket, and I would actually start to put Melbourne, if I left out the population explosion, into that lower tier bucket. And the reason being is those changes to land tax late last year has had a real impact on investor sentiment around the residential housing market. And we are seeing listings rise in Melbourne. And I think that's investors offloading properties where they are struggling with those land tax payments. So we are seeing the pace of dwelling prices ease in Melbourne. I don't think the pace of dwelling prices nationally will match what we saw last year anyway, because affordability has become more stretched with the pickup in prices over last year. But I just think in Melbourne, there is the potential perhaps not to perform as strongly as some of these other markets. One thing I will point out is that Australians living in New South Wales and Victoria post-COVID, we did see more Australians leave those states to live somewhere else than Australians coming into Victoria and New South Wales. But what we're seeing now with the net interstate migration flows is that actually in Victoria, it's almost come back to zero. So no longer are you having net outflows to the rest of the country. I think part of that is because compared to some markets like New South Wales and Queensland and even South Australia, Melbourne doesn't look as great. And so that is encouraging Melburnians to stay in the state, given that the labour market is still very solid here. What I am concerned about with Victoria, if I can just stretch that a bit further, is just the pipeline of capital expenditure projects over the long term. Very solid at the moment in the pipeline. But then if I have a look at what might be inked in the future, that really slows down quite significantly in Victoria. So we're just watching that quite closely in terms of the state. So I guess the broad picture is that the housing shortage will continue, but I think it won't be as acute in Victoria as in some other states and territories. I do agree that you do need to look at planning and overhauling that, but I think you also need to look at tenancy laws. I also think you need to look at how taxes interact with each other. And you've got to look at that more broadly you've got to make any changes gradually. They've got to be grandfathered. And the reason they have to be gradual is because there's more people that own a home or have a mortgage than there are people that are about to enter the market. So it's politically fraught. Remember the birthday cake with John Hewson? If you're too young to remember that, Google it. It is a funny video. But then you also had the Bill Shorten losing the unlosable election, and then you've had the voice referendum. So those three are combined, I think, would be sending important signals to both sides of politics that it would make politicians, I think, quite fearful of really taking on significant reform to address that housing shortage.